Hey, it's John from Tinderbox Arts. So it's time for a new set of tires on my 2010 Triumph Bonneville. And anytime I'm doing tires, it's always a good time to look at seals and bearings because that's an easy time to replace them. And last time I did, in fact I made a video, last time I did the tires on this, which was about 9,500 miles ago, the front bearings were done. And I ended up replacing the front bearings, which I have a video about. I did not replace the rear bearings at the same time. So here in the rear wheel, there's a few other things besides the bearings themselves you want to look at. One is they have these spacers, which basically are what the rubber seal. So here's the spacer, and here's the seal. So the seal seals against that spacer, and you can see there's a line on that spacer. I flipped this the previous time. That line was from the original seals, and I flipped the spacer around for a clean machined area, and now the new area is starting to get a groove as well. So I did purchase new spacers and of course new seals, because in order to get the bearings out you have to remove the seal. So, and it's a good idea anyway, honestly. For 9,500 miles, that's a decent run for seals anyway. So I got new spacers, new seals, and new bearings. And this one I can spin by hand, but at a certain juncture I do feel a little bump. So it's not quite as smooth as it should be. So I'm glad I got the new bearings. So the rear bearings seem to last longer than the front. And the third bearing on the rear, see if I can do this one-handed. If I pull this out, alright, so you got the bearing in this, and then you got this bearing here, which again doesn't really seem too bad, but if I'm going to be replacing all of them, I'm going to replace all of them. Now in here is another spacer, which that's literally just a spacer, and I don't really think you need a new one of those. Now just to review, if you haven't done this before, to get the rear wheel out of the bike, it's not terribly difficult. Well, I think on the rear you actually do have to take the caliper off, the brake caliper off, so there's two bolts there, and you want to hang it up somehow so it's not hanging on the cable. Then you loosen the tensioners here, and then there's the axle bolt. So actually this is, I think on this side it was 15/16, and this side it was a metric size. I'm sure they're both metric, but those are the only wrenches I had that fit. So you're going to loosen those. You had to take the muffler off in order to get the axle bolt out, but once you loosen the axle bolt nuts, you just slide the axle bolt out, the tire drops down. You got to fuss with the chain a little bit to get that off. There's a chain guard right here. I took that off mostly because I want to clean it, but also it can kind of get in the way, so you can do that too, but not terrible to get off. Alright, so you saw from my previous video on the front wheel, the way to get these bearings out, really the only way, is to wedge something against the inner race of the bearing. So the inner race is right there. That's what I'm moving right now. And the opposite side is the same way, because there's no way to drive this out. There's no way to get to the outer race of the bearing. There's just no other way of doing this. So you need to wedge something in there, and there's two methods of doing this. And once you wedge something in there, you can drive it out from the other side with a drift pin. So the two methods, what I used last time was this. So this is it's a concrete anchor or a sleeve anchor. It obviously is not meant for this, but the way that it works is it has a nut on the end here. As you screw that nut down on this bolt, it drives these sleeves towards the end here, which has a wedge or a sloped area right here, and as the sleeve hits that wedged area, it expands outward. So what you're going to do is put this area right here where the inner bearing race is, the inner race of the bearing, I'll get the words out, is, and that will drive outward and wedge itself in there. Once it's jammed in there, you just take a drift pin from the other side and just whack it out. The bearing is ruined in the process, but you can get it out. Now the other method is to use the official tool, which I've purchased here. I didn't actually own this before, and it doesn't have a good reputation because it's cheap Chinese junk. If you want to get better quality, it's quite expensive and probably not worth it. But the Chinese junk, I'm going to give it a try. So the way this works is same principle. It has these metal devices here with slots. So as you drive this bolt through, it's going to expand this end here. So again, you're just going to put this part in the inner race of the bearing, drive this down, it'll expand, and then you can attach a slide hammer to the end here and try to pull the bearing out. Or I think you could probably also get away with using a drift pin on this side as well. Okay, I have all my bits and pieces now. Got my seals, some spacers. The bearings are actually in a freezer right now, and I'll explain about that in a minute. And I have my setup here. I'm actually using the old tire just as something to keep the new one off the ground so I don't scratch the wheel. And I'm set up here. And the first thing I want to do is take out this seal, the old seal. Alright, to pry out the old seal, there's a couple different tools you could use. This is a seal puller. It's a specially designed tool for the purpose. So that's one option. It basically just has some curved areas here. It's very thin, designed to get in there and pull that out. But honestly, you can just use a flat screwdriver, a big one. One thing I like to do though is get a piece of wood or something soft so that if I'm prying out, I can pry against the wood rather than the actual wheel itself. For the heck of it, I'll try the seal puller here first. One thing you want to make sure is not to go too deep because you'll scratch the surface over here. So you just go enough to get the seal but not the wall. It can be tricky sometimes. Now I'm not sure the seal puller is actually going to work, but let's give it a try. Oh, that did work. Alright, so that just pried it out. Alright, so there's our seal, right? And inside here, you'll notice there's a snap ring. You can see there are the holes for it right there. So to get that snap ring out, you need snap ring pliers. There are other ways of doing it. You could use a couple of picks to go in those holes. Maybe some kind of homemade tool, but honestly, for the cost, better to get some snap ring pliers. It's just a lot easier. And all they have kind of a pointed end to them, and otherwise they work just like regular pliers. And the point is, I'll show you a close-up in a minute, but the point is to get that pointed part into those holes I just showed you a second ago, and then squeeze it together. And always be careful to cover this because it's going to want to pop into the shop. And that's out. Alright, so there's a close-up of the snap ring. So now we're free to work on the bearing. So on this side, there's no snap ring, it's just a bearing. And on the other side we just showed you, the snap ring's out and the bearing is exposed. So what I need to do is, using the inside race like we talked about, I need to remove one of these bearings and there'll be a spacer in between. Alright, this is the tool we talked about, and there's a potential problem already, right? Which is the way this is situated. It has, a long tubular area like this and a little area at the end here which protrudes. Well, if I stick that into this inner race, there's a spacer in there. I'm not sure that you can sort of see the edge of the spacer right in the middle there right now. And that spacer will prevent this tool from going all the way in and expanding. So really all I'm going to be able to do with this tool is this very end will expand, which isn't much because that's a very thin area, can expand and go against that inner race. Alright, so we'll get this tool inserted here, but I got to be careful not to go too far and hit that spacer because I don't want to expand against that. I don't want to bugger that up. And the way this thing works is you got a wrench on one side and another wrench to crank it down. Now I can get started a little bit because the hole is bigger than this. Alright, that's a little bit better fit to start with. And I'm just going to crank down in this until I get it good and tight. Not too tight that I break the tool, but tight enough that it'll grip. So now I could use a slide hammer, which is how this is intended to be. I'd attach that slide hammer right to the end here. So I could take this slide hammer, screw it onto the end here, and use that. But instead of doing that, I suspect that's not going to do it. I'm going to try putting a drift pin from the other side, the opposite side, and then giving it a whack with a hammer and see if this thing will pop out or not. So I'm just using a brass drift and a hammer, and I'll insert that from the other side and bang on the end of this. So either the tool itself is going to pop out or the whole bearing will. So let's see what happens. And there's your answer. So the tool is just not strong enough in this case. Now the redneck tool, you'll remember, is just an expanding anchor. So this end part right here needs to expand against the inner race of the bearing, and my hope is it'll have more meat to it touching the inside race. Alright, that's pretty well jammed in there. It's already distorting here. If I go any further, I'm going to actually have a problem there. So let me turn this around and we'll start giving it a whack with a hammer and see what happens. Same thing as before. I got a hammer and a drift pin from the other side. It's coming out. And that's it. Pops right out. There's my drift pin. And the bearing is over here. So here's my bearing, right? And there's enough there where it grabs the inner race. So this is where we just took the bearing out. It all looks good. And you could just see there that if I get the light just right, down in the bottom there is the inner race of the opposite bearing. You can just see it right in the middle there, right there. Alright, so we could just take a drift pin or even a socket with an extension, and if we get it just right, we could just whack that out by hitting the inner race, but nothing else. Or, if you're concerned about it, you can use the same method that we just used. Let me turn this around. But there's the bearing we need to get out. Okay, I've identified a socket on an extension, and that socket is big enough to catch the inner race, but not too big to hurt the surrounding area. Alright, so I'm just going to install that. I do have to watch what I'm doing here so that I don't hurt the wheel itself. So that looks about right. Alright, you probably heard that change in sound, I hope, on camera. Already I can tell it's moving, so we're in good shape. About to come out. There it is. So here's a bearing from the opposite side, okay? Now these are destroyed once you do this. Once you start whacking on this inner race, you're putting a lot of stress on that bearing and it's ruined. But that's fine. We're going to replace them anyway. So that's out of the way. And now I just want to clean this up inside where the new bearing is going. Make sure there's no burrs or marks or anything that I screwed up. Just clean all that nice, and we'll get the new bearings installed. Alright, so this is the old bearing just as an example, but when we install the new bearing, we don't want to press on the inner race, we want to press on the outer race. That won't do any damage. And one thing we could do is just use a socket that's the right size for the outer edge here, but that is not too big for the area here that's receiving it. You don't want to have it so big that it starts buggering up this area. Just enough so it puts the outer race in, but not the outer area here. So a socket that's the right size is one option. Another option is to use a specialty tool like this, this is for installing seals or bearings or whatever, and you have different sizes. You get the right size on the outside, and then you use this to stick in there and whack that in. Another thing I'll mention is that I like to use grease on the outer area of the bearing. Now these are sealed bearings, so this grease is not getting in, but it does give a little more protection. If you get some water in there for some reason, it'll hit that grease and not get into the edges of the seal. The final strategy I want to mention is that I have these new bearings sitting in a freezer, and the reason I do that, it actually does work pretty well. Of course, metal expands and contracts with temperature. So this metal right here, it's aluminum, and it's room temperature. It's about 70 degrees Fahrenheit here right now. But when I freeze those bearings, they actually shrink a little bit. And in doing so, that just lets this get in here a little bit easier than it otherwise would. Alright, so here's the frozen bearing. It is cold. I want to make sure there's no inside or outside. In this case, there is not. Both sides are the same. Double check that. I'm just going to seal this with a little bit of grease. A little bit of grease there, alright, not a lot. And where'd my paper towel go? There we go. Make sure we're in good shape. I'll get this set so it feels like it's pretty well straight, but some of this is feel. So that one's There, that's about straight. Then I'm going to use this tool and just judge where I am. When I get near the bottom, I want to ease up. Again, I don't want to damage the inner race. And you can kind of hear when it hits bottom. Now, in this case, we're going to put the snap ring in. And I'll put some more grease in here. Make sure the snap ring fits tight. If the snap ring doesn't fit tight or doesn't fit in that slot, then I know something's wrong and I didn't seat the bearing well enough. All right, so we'll get the snap ring in here. Again, put your hand over it so if it lets loose, you don't lose it. Pretty simple. Just get that in the hole. And if it's in there good, it kind of clicks in place and you should be able to rotate. And it is. So you should be able to rotate it in the slot a little bit if you need to. Now the new seal, you want to check to make sure that there's a spring. See that spring in there? You want to make sure that's in place, not broken up at all, and that this area feels good. You know, there's no nicks or anything like that, and this seal looks good. Now, something to mention, some people will seal the outside area with silicone or something like that. There are cases where I will do that, especially automotive applications, but in this particular case, I don't think it's necessary. This is rubber here. It will seal. This area is in good shape, so I don't feel the need for it. So to put this in, again, we'll just set there is a little bit of grease around here, so I'll just set this about what feels right. And then I can use that driver. In fact, I can almost put it in with my hands. I can put it in with my hands. Honestly, that's why I like motorcycles. But anyway, you use this little driver here. Again, just tap it into the outside. You're not killing it here. And that's it. Now, as we do the other side, what's the first thing you want to think about? The spacer. Don't forget the spacer. Don't forget the spacer. It's so easy to do. So we're going to make sure we get that in there first, because if we don't do that right, we got a problem. Alright, this side, the bearing goes in the same way. Just checking it to make sure we're good. But because of that spacer, now different wheels may be different, but that spacer is supposed to basically kiss the edge of the inside race. I don't want to whack this in. Sometimes the depth here is variable, so I don't want to whack this so far that I damage this thing. So I'm just going to get it here, and then I'm just going to take my time, tap it in until I feel this inner race just kiss the other one. Getting close. I can still feel that spacer wobbling a little bit, so I know when I'm close. I'm just about there. That's pretty good. Now some, other wheels may be a little bit different, but sometimes the spacer is such that, you can't screw it up. Other times you can, so just be careful that you're not damaging the bearing. All right, the last part of this rear wheel is the hub, and this is a little simpler in a sense. So on this hub, there's a spacer here, and then there's a spacer, it might be called something else, but there's a spacer on this side as well. And unfortunately, they did not send me this. I gotta look again, but I don't see it there. So this is worn in on one side from the seal originally. Then I flipped it and got a little more life out of it, but that's starting to wear. So it kind of pisses me off they didn't send this, but I may have to reuse this for now. But the seal rides on this. It's just aluminum. It's soft. Anyway, on this we have a seal right here, okay, on this side, and there's a bearing inside here. And then if I flip this around, you can see the other side of the bearing here. And then this area right here, it's kind of a bushing, and that rides on the inner part of the wheel. It's in excellent shape. I don't need to mess with that, but I do need to grease it up when I put it back together. But to get this bearing here out, again, I'm going to remove this seal just like I showed you before, pop this bearing out just like I showed you before using the inner race, and put the new one in using the outer race. Same deal, it's just a lot easier to get to. All right, we're all cleaned up and ready to go back together. One last thing I want to mention though is make sure you clean off all the old grease from the axle, everything. And when you apply the new grease, make sure you cover everything that you just took off. And the point of this is that not all grease types are compatible. The base that they use can be incompatible, so you don't really know necessarily what the old grease was, so better just to wipe everything off, use new grease on everything, and you should be good to go.